The new model we're going to learn about is called Aggregate Demand, Aggregate Supply, or ADAS. Similar to supply and demand, we're going to learn demand first, in this case aggregate demand, then learn about aggregate supply, and then put them together. Some differences here is that there's actually 3 lines involved with the ADAS model because we have a short run aggregate supply and a long run aggregate supply. So there's going to be 3 lines in our model. And the other difference would be that aggregate means overall or total. So this is not for an individual product. So normal supply and demand, there would be a title of the individual good at the top. Here you don't need that because once you've labeled it AD for aggregate demand, you've already clearly shown that this is for all goods in the economy. Other differences. When we before just had price was for an individual product. Price level is not. Price level is showing the overall economy. So it can be labeled PL, or what I normally do is APL for the aggregate price level. So this is going to show us the inflation rate for the economy at large. And instead of just having quantity, we have real GDP. We've learned that real GDP is the measure of GDP that shows us the overall output or overall quantity in the economy because we've already removed the effect of price. You can also label this as AO for aggregate output. I always do real GDP, but I just wanted you to see what the options were. So we mentioned that supply and demand, the individual models, were for individual goods. So if you were comparing two substitute products like Coke and Pepsi, they each would have their own supply and demand model. And what could be a move along the curve for one would be a shift for the other. Aggregate demand is economy-wide. So we're looking at how all households, firms, government buyers and international buyers are all purchasing goods in the economy. So as the price level falls, as things get cheaper, the overall quantity demanded will increase. So the same things apply that as price goes down, demand goes up. There's that same inverse relationship before, but this is for all quantities of all goods from the perspective of all buyers or consumers. I mentioned this on the slide opening, but oftentimes it's good to have that refresher that real GDP is a measure of overall output in our economy. We learned that real GDP was output times base year price. We're looking at that old price to remove the effect of price level changes. So with real GDP, all we have left is quantity of output. It's the one that shows us how much we actually made. It's the one that shows us if our economy actually grew because it focuses on quantity. So for that reason, you can use real GDP on the quantity axis, or you could use aggregate output because both of them are showing us the overall quantity of output produced by that country. Just like regular demand, aggregate demand is also downward sloping because as prices fall, the quantity of products demanded goes up. And in this case, we're looking at all overall prices, but as everything in the economy gets cheaper, your demand for everything, the quantity that you demand, would increase. So those words that we used before, a shift is an increase or a decrease, and a move along the curve is a quantity increase or quantity decrease. Those things still apply here. So in this visual, we can see that the price level is given to us as a GDP deflator. Remember, that is one of those price indices that we learned about before. So overall price level could be given to us in terms of inflation rate or a price index like the GDP deflator. So don't let that throw you off. Now what we're looking at here is we have a move along the curve to the right. If there's a move along the curve to the right, is it an increase or a decrease, or a quantity increase or a quantity decrease? A move along the curve to the right is a quantity increase, because right is always an increase. A right shift would be an increase, but if it's a move along the curve, the quantity increased. So as the price levels fall, the quantity of goods purchased rises, and that makes sense. We have a few more differences between simple demand for a single product and aggregate demand before we get into shifting, moving along the curve, and all of those things. So the first difference between the two is in regular demand, we had substitutes. So when we were talking about Coke and Pepsi a moment ago, if the price for Coke went up, you could just buy Pepsi, right? You have that option. So you could switch from one substitute good to another. But if we're looking at the overall, the aggregate price level, there are no substitutes. Everything has gone up in price. If the APL, if the inflation rate is saying that everything costs more, then there are no substitutes. So you can't switch from one product to another. Also, this is giving us the change in all final goods and services. So we would never see inflation in the simple supply and demand. You would just see the price of one product or another product. But we're looking at deflation. We're looking at any major effect on the economy at large. So it wouldn't just be there's a shortage of bread. That's not going to apply here at all in the aggregate demand model. And then finally, the reason why substitutes don't show up is the idea is if you drink fewer bottles of Coke and you switch to Pepsi, you're still buying soda. And if you're still buying the same amount of soda than you were buying before, then there's been no change in the overall quantity of goods and services. So as long as the thing that you're buying is still made in the same country, and that's an assumption that we do have to make. If everything in America costs more, so you start buying something somewhere else, now that would be a decrease in aggregate demand for American products, right? So we have to keep in mind, as long as you're buying the same quantity of goods here, then none of those things would show us any effect on aggregate demand, even though they would show a change on regular demand. If you remember from regular supply and demand, the price axis was always the non-shifter. It was the move along the curve. That a change in price was a move along the curve for for regular demand and also for regular supply. In this case, a change in the aggregate price level, which you can always shorten as APL, will be a move along the curve. So that's nice and consistent. It's always that price axis that's going to be our move along the curve. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that a change in APL can sometimes go by different names. If you see in the question that inflation went up, that is a change in the aggregate price level, or deflation occurred. That's still telling us that the aggregate price level fell. It could even mention that GDP deflator. If that went up or went down, that would tell us if APL went up or went down. So be aware that it's just one move along the curve, but there's many things that are telling us that the aggregate price level changed. Inflation, deflation, disinflation, GDP deflator, the CPI, Consumer Price Index, PPI, Producer Price Index, all of those are saying the price level changed. So be aware, it goes by lots of names. Now, if the aggregate price level goes up, then the overall spending will go down. So that would be a move along the curve to the left, which is showing a decrease in the quantity of aggregate demand. Knowing that APL is the move along the curve for aggregate demand, there's actually a few reasons why and effects that aggregate price level changes will have on the economy as a whole. And there's three reasons why a change in APL leads to a move along the curve, a change in the quantity of aggregate demand. And that will be the real wealth effect. So we're going to take the value of your assets and adjust it for price level to get us the real wealth. International trade effect, because other people can buy our stuff too, and we can buy things from other countries. And then finally, the interest rate effect. So we haven't talked about interest rates a lot, but we're going to get into them in much more detail because they will be involved in aggregate demand in quite a few ways, actually. The main concept of a move along the curve is saying that As aggregate price level falls, the quantity of aggregate demand is going to go up. So the first reason why that's true is the real wealth effect. So when APL falls, your purchasing power goes up. Remember, if everything costs you less, each individual dollar buys more. So all that money that you have in the bank, the current wealth that you already have, now has a higher value if it will buy more. So consumer spending for all goods and services is going to increase. As prices fall, the quantity of all goods that you are now able to buy has gone up, and that's a move along the curve. If the aggregate price level went up, the purchasing power of your money would go down, and the quantity of all goods and services that you would buy would decrease. So there is a negative or inverse relationship between APL and consumer spending because the value of your wealth, the value of the money that you have in the bank, the value of your assets is going to be affected by the change in the aggregate price level. Another reason why the change in APL would cause a move along the curve for aggregate demand is international trade effect. So other people can buy our products too. You don't have to be an American citizen. So if the price level falls in the US, all of the goods and services in the US are now relatively cheaper than they used to be. So if you are someone from another country who is in the market for an American good, the demand will increase. The quantity that you would demand of those goods would increase. If all of the price level in America went up, our goods would be relatively more expensive, and the quantity demanded from these international buyers would decrease. Other people can demand our products. Aggregate demand is demand of the entire economy, not just your country. The last reason why APL, or change in aggregate price level, causes a move along the curve for AD gets more complicated. So for the interest rate effect, we're going to have to talk about money demand and a new model and to get into why this is true. So generally speaking, when interest rates change, it will affect the demand for money. And that will lead to a change in investment and consumer spending. So we're going to go step by step and see why this is the case. So in step one, people and firms keep money on hand for transactions. That is all of the things that you want to buy. If you need to pay someone, you need to have cash on hand for various needs in your day. When aggregate price level goes up, the purchasing power of money falls. So if everything costs more, you need more money on hand for all of those things that you are already going to do. So when money demand goes up, if everything costs more, prices went up, money demand goes up too. We need more cash to pay for transactions, so people go to the bank to withdraw more cash to have more of the money on hand. They also could potentially take out a loan that will have the same effect on the interest rate. So either way, higher prices leads to people needing more cash. That's step one. Okay, so when people demand more money, that's going to affect this model in front of you. We haven't learned this model yet, but it's coming. This is called the money market. It's about cash. So we have MS, which is money supply. You'll learn later why that's a vertical line, but just go with it for now. So we have money supply, MD is money demand, we have the quantity of money, and then NIR stands for the nominal interest rate, because the demand for money impacts interest rates. So we just said when prices go up, does that affect demand or supply of money? Demand of money. So when prices go up, people need more money. So money demand shifts right. So as you can see, the effect on the nominal interest rate, it was here, and the nominal interest rate went up. Even without being able to draw this model, you can look at the model and you can see, okay, the equilibrium was here, and now it's here, so the interest rate went up. When interest rates are higher, the cost of borrowing is higher. If a consumer or a firm needed to take out a loan to buy something, it's now going to cost them more when interest rates are high. So higher interest rates will reduce the quantity that they'd want to buy. Or if they wanted to put it on their credit card, if interest rates go up, the interest that you would pay on your credit card payment would go up. So the quantity of products would go, quantity of demand would go down. So we're starting with prices went up, which push interest rates up. And when interest rates are high, the quantity of, they're called interest sensitive expenditures, goes down. An interest sensitive expenditure. Expenditure is just a fancy word for spending. You can probably see spending in that. An interest sensitive expenditure is any spending that you'll have to pay interest. So anytime you're borrowing money or financing a purchase. So you're taking out a loan or you're using a credit card. And there's a lot of purchases made by consumers and firms, investment spending, that's interest sensitive. And so the overall quantity of purchases would go down if interest-sensitive purchases now are relatively more expensive because they're paying higher interest. So we have, one more time, prices went up, which pushes up the demand for money, which pushes up interest rates. And when interest rates are high, interest-sensitive spending done by households and firms goes down. Now, the reason why G is not there, government does not pay interest rates the same way that people do. They also borrow money, but their interest rates are different from the ones that consumers and firms pay, and they take longer to pay back and all of those things. They're less concerned about interest rates when it comes to government borrowing. So when we're talking about interest-sensitive spending, we're really only ever talking about consumer spending and investment spending because government plays by different rules when it comes to interest rates and borrowing. One thing I wanted to point out here is that interest rates can be tricky, not just in understanding how they work, but in realizing that interest rates may be a shifter or they might not be. So it depends what started everything. If interest rates change because prices changed, so if APL came first and APL led to a change in interest rates, then that's a non-shifter. That's a move along the curve. If interest rates changed independently, they change separately. So, for example, interest rates change all the time because the Federal Reserve decides to change interest rates. That's going to be a shifter. That's going to be one of our categories. So, are interest rates the cause or are they the effect? If they're the cause, it's a shifter. If they're the effect of the original change in aggregate price level, then it's a non-shifter. So just be careful with interest rates to determine, is it because of APL? Then it's a move along the curve. If it's not, it's a shift. Now that we know that APL, aggregate price level, is the non-shifter for aggregate demand, we're going to get into all the things that do shift the model. A shift means that quantity demanded at any price level will be different. So instead of talking about quantity increased or quantity decreased, we're going to use the words increase and decrease if there's a shift. And just like in the regular supply and demand model, if aggregate demand increases, it shifts right. Right is an increase. If aggregate demand shifts left, that's a decrease. So those rules that we had before still apply. So the acronym for the shifters of aggregate demand is GREWIT, because the economy is growing if we're demanding more products, theoretically. So the first shifter is GDP, and we know that GDP includes consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, and net export. So a change in any of those things is going to be a change in GDP, and those will shift aggregate demand. Resource size is about the stock of physical capital. It's basically how much can your company currently produce, and do you need to be able to spend money and buy products and buy machines in order to produce more, or are you doing okay with your amount of physical capital that you currently have? Expectations might look similar to regular supply and demand expectations, but this is different. This is not expecting a price to change because we wouldn't look at one individual price for aggregate demand. We're looking at expecting something economy-wide. So basically, do you have confidence that the economy is going to be better in the future? Are you optimistic? Or do you think that we're headed towards a recession and therefore you're pessimistic of the future? That will affect your desire to buy products, aggregate demand. Wealth and income are also shifters. So this is about the income of the people and the wealth level, so the value of your assets like stocks. Interest rates, as we just saw, are a shifter if they are the independent thing, if they are changing not because of aggregate price level. And interest rates that change independently are always done through monetary policy. So we're going to learn a little bit about what monetary policy is and how it works, how it changes interest rates. And the last thing is fiscal policy, which includes government spending, taxes, and transfers. I don't have government spending here because government spending is part of GDP. It's the G in SIG XM. So either way, we've covered all parts of fiscal policy in AD shifters. You've learned that one of the major equations for GDP is SIG XM. Consumer spending plus investment spending plus government spending plus exports minus imports. And exports minus imports can be grouped together. And what is the title for this collection? Exports minus imports are called net exports. So as long as you group them together, then this rule works. If any of these things increase, AD shifts right. So if consumer spending goes up, if investment spending goes up, government spending, or if net exports goes up, then AD would go up too. It would shift to the right. Now, if imports by themselves goes up, then the rule won't work because if imports alone go up, then we actually have a decrease in net exports. So as long as they're together, this rule works. If any of these four major sections, consumer, investment, government, or net exports, go down, then AD would shift to the left, it would decrease. So a change in any of these variables will shift to aggregate demand. Resource size can be an individual business decision. This is the idea that we've learned that firms have planned investment spending and unplanned investment spending. And often they decide when to spend money based on the current existing stock of physical capital. Remember, physical capital are tools. They're machines. So if your business has a lot of physical capital, then you're doing just fine and you are able to produce everything that you need to keep up with demand for their products. So if the existing stock of physical capital is high, you don't need to spend any more money. So investment spending would be down. So this category, this shifter of resource size, is really tied to investment spending. So oftentimes you could explain the reason why being a change in resource size or a change in investment spending. If a company feels like their stock of physical capital is too low and they're not able to keep up with the current demand for their products, then they would need to spend more money, buy more pieces of physical capital, so their investment spending would go up. And if investment spending goes up, aggregate demand would shift to the right. So if you have enough physical capital, your investment spending goes down, AD shifts left. If you don't have enough current physical capital, if you need more resources, investment spending would increase and AD would shift to the right. Expectations as an aggregate demand shifter is different from expectations for normal supply and demand. There we were looking at your expectations for the price of an individual item. Do you expect it to go up or to go down in the future? Since we're talking on the aggregate scale, we're looking at your overall expectations for the economy. Do you have confidence that things are going to be good in the future, or do you feel like things are going to be bad in the next few years? So this affects both consumer and business confidence. If consumers feel like things are good, that means they're not worried about getting fired or getting laid off in the future. So they would have strong confidence in the future of the economy. And if you think things are going to be better, you're going to spend more money. They also tend to take on more debt. They're going to do more of those interest-sensitive expenditures because they feel like they'll have the ability to pay off any debt as long as they continue getting paid in the future. If consumers are pessimistic and they think things are going to be bad in the next few years, they tend to decrease their spending because they are afraid of not being able to pay for those goods or going into debt in the future because of it. Businesses look to the future in terms of sales. So consumers want to keep their jobs. Businesses want to make sure that their product will continue to be in demand. If you expect future sales to be high, they're more likely to do investment spending, spend more money on capital goods and equipment, boost your resource size and your physical capital in order to produce more sales in the future. If businesses think the future is going to be bad for business, they're less likely to do any of those planned investment spending opportunities. They're going to decrease their spending overall. The key words to look for when you're looking for expectations as a shifter are optimism and pessimism. This could be about consumers or firms, and sometimes you'll see consumer confidence and talking about how consumer confidence is high or low. So if consumers and firms feel like the future is going to be strong economically, you'll see that optimism is high. This will shift AD to the right because they're going to want to make more purchases of all goods if they feel like their jobs are safe and their companies are going to continue having strong sales. If they feel like the future is going to be poor, then you'll see pessimism. Maybe they'll say businesses are pessimistic or households are pessimistic about the future. All of those things will decrease overall spending and shift AD to the left. You might hear on the radio about consumer confidence. Consumer confidence is on the rise or something like that. And that's a measure of overall expectations for the economy. So we were getting into the fact that expectations is different than regular supply and demand because you're just thinking about the overall economy, not expecting a price change in the future. The other way that expectations is different is that in this case, it will not be a double shifter. It's not going to shift supply and demand because we're talking about whether businesses and households think the future is going to be good. That only affects AD. It only affects their spending on goods and services in the future. It will not shift aggregate supply. The next shifter for aggregate demand is wealth or income. So in terms of wealth, the real value of assets can change economy-wide. We talked about how the stock market is an example of overall wealth in the economy, and it makes sense that if people feel like their assets and the value of their possessions are increasing, they're going to feel more comfortable spending money, so aggregate demand will go up. But if the value of your assets, if all of your stocks and your investments and the property that you own, if it's going down in value, if wealth is decreasing, you're not going to feel as comfortable going shopping, and so aggregate demand would decrease. Real incomes is the concept that your income, your nominal income, is how much you get paid. But real income, we're comparing that income to the price level. And if your income is increasing faster than the price level is, then your real income has increased. Your money will go further and you'll feel more comfortable buying more goods. Aggregate demand would increase. On the opposite, if your real income is decreasing, that inflation is going up faster than your wages or your income, then you're not going to spend as much money and aggregate demand would shift left. Income does not only apply to American households. If our real income increases, then we will spend more money, AD goes up. But our real income could not change at all, and there could still be an effect on aggregate demand if foreign incomes go up. So if another country, let's say Germany, if their national income rises faster than our income level, that means that they're going to be able to purchase both more German products and also more American products. So if income levels are rising in other parts of the world, and those are parts of the world that do buy American goods, that can also increase aggregate demand. The next aggregate demand shifter is interest rates. Now, before we get into how interest rates shift aggregate demand, we have to talk about monetary policy. There's two different major types of government policy: monetary policy and fiscal policy. And we'll introduce both of them today, but both of them will go into a lot more detail later on during the year. So, as the intro, monetary policy is kind of how the name implies. So it's about money, and it's the quantity of money in our economy. So the Federal Reserve is the central bank of America. So it's not your typical bank in the sense that banks bank with the Federal Reserve. They have reserve accounts, they have extra money that they keep for the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is appointed by our government, but they operate independently. And we do that because we want to make sure that our president and our Congress is not in charge of printing money, because that could lead to corruption and inflation and problems like that. If you had a lot of debt, you just print more money, which would hurt our inflation rate. So in America, we keep our monetary policy completely separate from the central government, and it's controlled by the Federal Reserve. As you saw earlier on this module, when the quantity of money is changed, that's the money supply, and that affects the interest rate. When the money supply goes up, the interest rates go down. When the money supply is decreased, interest rates go up. So as long as you know that it's affecting quantity of money, which changes interest rates, and it's controlled by the Federal Reserve, that's the basic idea of monetary policy for now. So here we have a little bit more detail about how monetary policy works and why it actually affects interest rates, and how those interest rates will then affect aggregate demand, because that's what we're trying to see in this model. You're not going to need to use that money supply, money demand model that we learned earlier, because we haven't actually learned that model yet. So we're going to learn this explanation, just understanding how money works. Okay, so the Fed is the nickname for the Federal Reserve. And when the Fed increases the quantity of money that's circulating throughout our economy, that means both households and firms have more money. So if everybody has more access to cash, you don't have to go to a bank to get a loan necessarily. If you could easily borrow $100 from your friend, your neighbor, your grandmother, then you don't have to go to the bank. You can borrow money from anybody. So when anybody can get a loan, interest rates fall, because in order to get banks to entice people to come in and get a loan from them, they have to lower interest rates. Interest rates are the price of a loan. So to encourage people to get loans from banks, they're going to lower their prices. They're going to lower their interest rates. And when interest rates are down, that increases investment spending and consumer spending of those interest-sensitive expenditures. So what this is telling you is that when there's more money supplied, you can get a loan from a lot of places, not just a bank. So banks lower their interest rates to entice borrowers to come to them for loans. And if interest rates are down, C and I increase. And you have seen the consumer spending and investment spending are both part of shifters of aggregate demand because they're part of GDP. And if any of those things go up, aggregate demand will shift to the right. Now, if this went the opposite direction, if the Fed decided to take money out of circulation, then there'd be a lot less cash available. And if you needed a loan, you'd have to go to the bank. And there would be so many people that needed loans that banks can now start being picky. They can choose, they can be more discriminating about who they'd like to give loans to. And so they can raise interest rates, because if there's a line of people at the door who want a loan, they can raise prices of loans and still have people that want them. So less money supplied leads to an increase in interest rates. And if interest rates go up, consumer and investment spending would go down, and so aggregate demand would shift to the left. The second type of government policy is fiscal policy. And fiscal policy actually has three parts. It includes government spending, taxes, and transfers. Now, the reason I don't have government spending listed here as the shifter of AD is that that's already included within GDP because government spending is part of that equation. So we already have it covered somewhere else. Although you certainly could use fiscal policy as an explanation for why government spending led to aggregate demand going up or down. Okay, so fiscal policy is those three categories of things, and it's controlled by Congress and the president in America. So different countries will have different methods for that sort of thing, but here both those groups have power. And the idea is that they work in different directions. If you increase government spending, then they're purchasing more goods, aggregate demand would go up. If you increase government transfers, remember these are those things that the government gives to citizens without expecting anything in return, like veterans benefits, food stamps, unemployment checks, Medicare. So if those things go up, there's more government transfers, that means that people have more disposable income. So an increase in government transfers leads to an increase of aggregate demand as well. So government spending and government transfers, an increase will lead to an increase in aggregate demand, a decrease will lead to a decrease in aggregate demand. Taxes are the opposite because more taxes reduces the amount of disposable income that you have. So an increase in taxes would actually cut down on aggregate demand because there's less money left over to buy goods, whereas a decrease in taxes would increase aggregate demand because you have more disposable income to purchase goods and services. We already discussed how the parts of fiscal policy, government spending, government transfers, and taxes can work in different directions, that government spending and transfers both work in one way and taxes work in the other way. But there's another variable here, and that is the change direct or indirect. So the only one that's direct is a change in G. Remember, G stands for government spending. And that's the idea that government spending, all of that money goes into the economy. That's why it's direct. So if the government increases government spending, they are directly buying stuff. So all that money shifts aggregate demand. So an increase in government spending shifts AD to the right every penny. A decrease in government spending shifts AD to the left. During wartime, there's always tends to be huge increases in government spending, and that tends to get us out of a recession if we were in one, or if we're not, then it can lead us into an inflationary period. We'll get into that later as you understand how this model works, but the idea is that government spending makes AD go up. Now, tax rates and government transfers are both indirect. And the reason is that neither one of those things are actually directly purchasing things. And remember, aggregate demand is demand for products. It's buying stuff, it's consumers. Well, the reason this is indirect is that taxes and transfers affect disposable income. And with that change in disposable income, you're going to spend some money, but you're going to save some money too. That MPC and MPS factors in here. So if your tax rates go down with that savings that you have, you might spend some of that money and that'll affect aggregate demand, but you won't spend every single penny. If you received more government transfers, more benefits, you're not going to spend every single penny of those benefits that are allocated towards you. Maybe they'll say that people on Medicare now can qualify for up to this much, but not everybody's going to spend that amount. So it's not going to be a direct change on aggregate demand. So both those things do shift it, but when we get into the dollar amount of the shift, 100% of that money is not going to shift to aggregate demand. Only the MPC, the marginal propensity to consume, because that's your demand. That's what consumers are doing. So government spending is direct, taxes and transfers are not. So if we're in a recession, do we want, I'm going to the italics questions in your notes now. If we're in a recession, do we want people to spend more money or less money to get us out of the recession? We want them to spend more money. So our goal in a recession is to increase aggregate demand. So if we want a direct increase in aggregate demand, first of all, which of these three things? We have government spending, we have taxes, and we have transfers. Which is the direct one? Government spending. All right, so if we want AD to go up, what do we do to government spending? We increase it, and that will give us a direct effect. Now, if we are trying to indirectly change it, what could you do to taxes to increase aggregate demand? You will decrease taxes, because remember, if you have fewer taxes to pay, you have more disposable income. And then how about transfers? Do we want to raise or lower transfers in order for us to have more aggregate demand? We want to raise them. And remember, that's what we were talking about on last slide, that government spending and transfers work in the same way. If they go up, aggregate demand goes up. But taxes are the opposite. So in order for aggregate demand to go up, taxes have to go down. And I color coordinated them based on direct. Green, the government spending, is the direct one. That orange font, the taxes and the transfers, are the indirect ones. So it's important to know all of these shifters. Remember, I always ask you about shifters, so study your shifters. And not just what things shift aggregate demand, but the direction that they shift them is going to be very important, of course. Now let's practice drawing this model and showing how it shifts or has to move along the curve. So the first situation says deflation occurs. So first of all, let's label it. So think about what are the necessary parts that you need to show aggregate demand and where they each go. All right, so we need APL to show aggregate price level for the price index. PL would be fine as well, but if you only put P there for price, that would be incorrect because it's not just price, it's the aggregate price level of the economy. We need the downward sloping line, and it needs to be labeled AD for aggregate demand. Just labeling it D would not be enough, that would lose the point. And then finally, the quantity axes should either have real GDP or AO for aggregate output. Either one of them is okay. So that's the setup. There's no title because this is not for one good, this is for the entire economy. Okay, now we have our situation. Deflation occurs. Will that be a shift or a non-shift? And then how would it look? That's going to be a move along the curve because deflation is a change in the aggregate price level. And if we have deflation, that means the aggregate price level fell. So you just put two dots and you need to have the arrow showing that the price went down. Remember, it doesn't have to say APL to be talking about APL, so you have to remember all those possible things that are implying a change in the aggregate price level. And also, when you have a move along the curve, don't label them made up things. Don't call that E and E2. Don't call it point A and point B. We don't know any of those things to be true. So we're just doing the 2 points along the line and the arrow showing the direction. And then you guys can tell that the price went down, but what happened to aggregate demand? How would you word the impact on it? So it went to the right. So does that mean it is an increase or the quantity increased? Because it's a move along the curve, that means the quantity increased. This next category, the dollar has depreciated in value, increasing our net exports. We haven't talked a lot about depreciation, but if something has depreciated, if it appreciates, the value goes up. If it depreciates, the value goes down. So this is about foreign exchange and trade with other countries. But the idea is if our dollar is weak, then our goods are cheaper. So net exports are going to go up because the world will want to buy more of our products. So does that help? Have we figured out what the shift would be or the non-shift? Okay, if net exports go up, that's going to shift AD to the right, and the reason will be GDP, net exports. That's the part of GDP that increased. The government decreases welfare and veterans benefits. Think about what the category would be and what would happen to aggregate demand. So 80 will shift left because what we're talking about is a decrease in government transfers. Welfare and veterans benefits are both government transfers, which are part of fiscal policy. And if government transfers go down, that means consumers have less disposable income left over. So their aggregate demand will go down. It will shift left. The Federal Reserve increases interest rates. What do we think will happen here? Okay, so we know that interest rates can either be a shift or move along the curve based on did interest rates change by themselves or did they change because the aggregate price level changed them? Here they change by themselves because the Federal Reserve deciding to do something is not because of aggregate price level. It is an independent change. So this is going to shift to aggregate demand. And if interest rates go up, that means things cost more if you're going to put them on your credit card or use a loan to pay for those things. So interest rates, which is part of monetary policy, will shift aggregate demand to the left. The government lowers personal income tax. So that will be an increase in aggregate demand. Taxes are part of fiscal policy, and if your taxes are lowered, then you have more disposable income, which can lead to more consumer spending. This would make aggregate demand go up. Here's our last example. The stock market has reached new record high levels of value. So what is going to happen on our model? This is our wealth/income shifter. So when the value of your assets, when your wealth has increased, you have more freedom. You feel like you have more flexibility in order to spend more money. Your possessions, your assets have a higher value. Aggregate demand will shift to the right.